So Donald Trump just kicked Canada out of the North American Strategic Trade and Security Framework. Not suspended, not downgraded, not put on probationary review while terms were renegotiated, expelled formally, publicly by executive order with immediate effect, severing the integrated economic and security architecture that has bound the two largest trading partners on Earth for over 3 decades. A sitting American president just removed an allied nation from the foundational agreement that governs how goods move, how intelligence is shared, how energy flows, and how the most productive bilateral economic relationship in human history actually functions. Within 72 hours, the move backfired so catastrophically that 3 American border state governors declared economic emergencies. The Dow dropped over 900 points in a single session, and Canadian officials began signing provisional trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India. Agreements that had been blocked for years by the exclusivity provisions of the very framework Trump had just torn apart. The pressure isn't building on Ottawa. The pressure is building on Detroit, on Buffalo, on Seattle, on every American city whose economy is wired into Canadian supply chains so deeply that most people forgot the wiring was even there. Warren Buffett said Trump just made the most expensive mistake in modern economic history, firing a partner who was doing more for you than you were doing for them, and then explained why the consequences of that mistake are not reversible. But it's what Mark Carney said in response. 7 words, delivered without notes directly into the camera, now printed on the front page of every major newspaper in the democratic world, that tells you this isn't a trade dispute, and it isn't a diplomatic rupture, and it isn't a negotiating tactic that went too far. This is the moment the most important economic relationship on Earth was broken by the country that needed it most. When you hear exactly what was inside the framework that Trump destroyed, what Canada was quietly providing that kept entire American industries operational, what Buffett explained about why you never fire the partner you depend on, and what Carney's 7 words revealed about who actually held the leverage in this relationship all along, you'll understand why this isn't Trump punishing Canada. This is Trump punishing the United States. Not metaphorically, not in the long run, right now, in ways that are hitting American factories, American ports, American grocery stores, and American energy grids before the ink on the executive order is dry. Hit subscribe because the consequences are compounding daily, and what comes next will determine whether the damage can be contained or whether it becomes permanent. Let me take you through exactly what happened, because the specifics matter, and what the White House isn't telling you matters even more. The North American Strategic Trade and Security Framework was not a simple trade deal. It was the operating system of the continental economy, a comprehensive agreement that integrated customs processing, regulatory harmonization, energy grid coordination, critical mineral supply chains, defense procurement, intelligence sharing protocols, and cross-border infrastructure management into a single unified framework that allowed goods, energy, and information to move between the United States and Canada with a speed and efficiency that no other bilateral relationship on Earth could match. The framework had been built incrementally over 31 years, negotiated across 6 administrations of both parties, and was considered by every serious economist and national security analyst to be the single most valuable structural advantage the American economy possessed. Not because it was flashy, but because it was invisible, because it worked so well that nobody thought about it, because the integration was so deep that most Americans had no idea how much of their daily life depended on it. Trump's executive order was 4 pages long. The language was blunt. It stated that Canada had failed to demonstrate adequate commitment to American economic priorities, and that the framework's provisions had been exploited by Canadian leadership to undermine American trade interests and resist legitimate American security requirements. The order gave Canada 72 hours to vacate all framework coordination offices, terminated all shared regulatory processes, revoked Canadian access to integrated customs systems, and suspended every joint program operating under the framework's authority, from energy grid synchronization to defense procurement pipelines to the shared border management protocols that process over $2 billion in cross-border trade every single day. There was no negotiation. There was no advanced warning to Congress. There was no consultation with the American industries that depended on the framework's infrastructure more than any Canadian industry did. The 72-hour timeline was not a deadline for compliance. It was a countdown to economic self-destruction. The language in the executive order was revealing in ways the White House clearly did not intend, failed to demonstrate adequate commitment to American economic priorities, as though the purpose of Canada's participation in a bilateral framework was to serve American priorities rather than mutual ones. Exploited by Canadian leadership as though operating within the terms of an agreement both nations sign constitutes exploitation. Resist legitimate American security requirements, as though compliance with American demands as a precondition for membership in a partnership between sovereign nations. Every phrase in the order told the same story. This was not an administration responding to a Canadian violation. This was an administration punishing Canada for having the audacity to negotiate as an equal rather than obey as a subordinate. The executive order didn't read like a policy document. It read like a termination letter from a boss who was angry that an employee had started acting like a partner. But here's what the White House either didn't know or didn't care about: what Canada was actually doing inside the framework and what the United States just lost by tearing it apart. Because the framework was not a gift from America to Canada. It was a deeply interdependent system in which Canada provided things the United States cannot function without, things that cannot be sourced from any other country, things that are dictated not by policy but by geography, by geology, by the physical reality of where resources exist on the North American continent. And every one of those things disappeared from American access the moment the executive order took effect. Start with energy. Canada supplied 61% of all crude oil imported by the United States, 38% of natural gas imports in northern states, and 97% of electricity imports for border communities from Maine to Washington state. The framework's energy grid synchronization protocols allowed power to flow seamlessly across the border, balancing loads during peak demand, preventing blackouts during extreme weather, and providing the redundancy that kept the lights on in 14 American states during every winter storm, every summer heat wave, every grid emergency for the last 2 decades. That synchronization was terminated by the executive order. Not reduced, not renegotiated, terminated. Within 48 hours, grid operators in New England, the Upper Midwest, and the Pacific Northwest activated emergency protocols they had never used outside of simulation exercises, warning of potential rolling blackouts if demand spiked during what forecasters were already calling one of the coldest winters in 15 years. Then, critical minerals. Canada is the primary or sole North American source of nickel, cobalt, potash, uranium, lithium, and 17 of the 23 rare earth elements that the Pentagon classifies as essential to national defense. The framework's mineral supply chain provisions guaranteed American defense contractors and technology manufacturers priority access to Canadian extraction at stable, pre-negotiated prices. Without the framework, those minerals are available on the open market, where China controls 67% of global rare earth processing and where prices are set not by bilateral agreement, but by whoever is willing to pay the most. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. Every major American defense contractor depends on Canadian critical minerals flowing through framework channels. The executive order didn't just disrupt a trade relationship. It handed China leverage over the American defense supply chain that Beijing had spent 2 decades trying to acquire, and that Trump delivered for free in a 4-page document. The auto industry, the backbone of manufacturing in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Tennessee, was built on framework integration so deep that a single vehicle crosses the U.S.-Canada border an average of 7 times during production. Engines manufactured in Ontario are shipped to assembly plants in Michigan, fitted with transmissions built in Indiana using Canadian aluminum, wired with harnesses assembled in Quebec, and shipped to dealers on trucks running on Canadian diesel. The framework's regulatory harmonization meant that these crossings happened seamlessly. Same safety standards, same emissions certification, same customs processing, same quality protocols. The executive order shattered that integration overnight. Every crossing now requires independent inspection, separate certification, new customs documentation, and compliance with two divergent regulatory systems instead of one harmonized framework. The Auto Alliance estimated the cost at $11,000 per vehicle, a cost that would be passed directly to American consumers, adding an average of $900 to the price of every car and truck sold in the United States within 6 months. And this is where the story changes into something the White House never intended it to be. Because expelling a nation from a bilateral framework is supposed to look like strength. It is supposed to demonstrate that the expelled party needed the framework more than the expelling party did. It is supposed to create pressure on the expelled party to seek readmission on less favorable terms, to come back humbled to accept concessions they had previously rejected. That is how expulsion works when you hold the leverage. But when the expelled party was providing 61% of your oil, 97% of your border electricity, the critical minerals your military depends on, and the integrated manufacturing infrastructure your largest industry is built around, expulsion doesn't demonstrate strength. It demonstrates that you just cut off your own supply lines and called it a victory. International law scholars condemned the unilateral nature of the expulsion within hours. The framework was a bilateral agreement. Both nations were parties. Both had rights under its provisions, and unilateral termination without the 60-day consultation period specified in Article 22 of the framework's charter constituted, according to three separate legal analyses published within the first week, a breach of international treaty obligations. A former Secretary General of the United Nations called it the most significant unilateral abrogation of a bilateral treaty by a major democracy in the post-war era. A professor of international economic law at the London School of Economics said that this was not how framework partnerships are dissolved between democratic allies, that it carried the vocabulary of dominion rather than partnership. 31 nations issued formal statements expressing concern within the first 72 hours, not because they cared about the U.S.-Canada framework specifically, but because every nation with an American bilateral agreement suddenly had to ask the same question. If the United States can tear up a 31-year framework with its closest ally in 72 hours, what is any American agreement actually worth? And then Carney responded. And for the first time in the escalating series of confrontations that had defined the previous 18 months, his tone was not analytical. It was not the cold strategic precision that had characterized his counter-tariff announcements, his diversification strategy rollouts, his Arctic framework press conferences. There was something different, something that millions of people watching recognized immediately as the sound of a leader who had moved past calculation into conviction. Not because the math had changed, but because the nature of what was being attacked had changed. The setting was a joint session of the Canadian Parliament convened on emergency notice, every seat filled, the galleries packed, diplomatic representatives from 23 nations present in the visitors' gallery. An unprecedented number assembled not because they were invited, but because they understood that what was about to happen in this chamber would set the terms for every alliance on Earth. Carney walked to the podium without notes. He stood for a moment in silence, looking out at the assembled members, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and absolutely steady. He spoke first to Canadians. 31 years ago, Canada entered into a framework with the United States based on a simple principle that two nations could build something together that neither could build alone. For 31 years, that principle held. Canadian energy powered American homes. Canadian minerals built American weapons. Canadian workers assembled American cars. Canadian ports moved American goods. Canadian intelligence protected American cities. We did this not as subordinates, but as partners, because partnership is how democracies relate to each other through mutual benefit, mutual respect, and mutual sovereignty. He paused. Yesterday, the President of the United States ended that partnership, not because Canada violated its terms, not because the framework failed, because Canada refused to accept terms that would have made partnership indistinguishable from submission. And so we were expelled, he continued, and the temperature in the room shifted. Let me be clear about what has happened and what has not happened. What has happened is that the United States has unilaterally destroyed the most productive bilateral economic relationship in human history. What has not happened is that Canada has been diminished. We are the same country today that we were yesterday. We have the same energy, the same minerals, the same ports, the same workers, the same geography, the same two coastlines, and the same Arctic frontier, and the same resources that the rest of the world is now lining up to access. Nothing has been taken from us. Something has been taken from the United States, our partnership, and that is their loss far more than it is ours. Then he turned to the camera, and his voice, still quiet, carried an edge that landed like a blade in every room it reached. To the President of the United States, you have expelled Canada from a framework that Canada helped build, that Canada sustained, and that Canada's resources made valuable. You did this believing it would bring us to our knees. You did this believing we would come back diminished, ready to accept whatever terms you dictated. You did this because you confused our partnership with your leverage. He stopped. The silence in the chamber was total. Then 7 words spoken with the finality of a door closing and a lock turning. You didn't remove us. You removed yourself. The chamber erupted, every member of Parliament on their feet. The ovation lasted over 90 seconds. Not the performative applause of political theater, but the sound of a nation recognizing that the words just spoken had permanently redefined its position in the world. "You didn't remove us. You removed yourself" was trending globally within 6 minutes. Within 30 minutes, it was the lead story on every major news network in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The Financial Times ran it as a banner headline. Japan's NHK interrupted programming. Francis Leone published a special edition. International media called it the 7 words that inverted a superpower. Negotiation professors at Harvard, Wharton, and INSAD began drafting case studies before Carney had left the podium. And here's the paradox that makes this the most expensive miscalculation of the entire confrontation. The paradox that the White House apparently never gamed out, and that transformed a punitive action into a strategic catastrophe. Inside the framework, Canada was constrained. The framework's exclusivity provisions limited Canada's ability to sign preferential trade agreements with non-member nations. The regulatory harmonization locked Canadian standards to American specifications. The energy integration committed Canadian supply to American demand at prices negotiated within the framework, prices consistently below global market rates. The mineral supply chain provisions gave American defense contractors priority access ahead of competing buyers from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The framework was, from Canada's perspective, a ceiling as much as a floor. It guaranteed access to the American market, but it also prevented Canada from fully accessing the global market, where Canadian resources commanded significantly higher prices and attracted significantly more competitive offers. Trump tore up the ceiling. The moment the executive order took effect, every constraint that had kept Canada locked into American favorable terms vanished. Canadian oil, previously committed to American refineries at framework rates, was now available to the highest global bidder, and the highest global bidder was not the United States. Canadian critical minerals, previously channeled to American defense contractors at pre-negotiated prices, were now available to European and Asian manufacturers willing to pay 30 to 40% more. Canadian ports, previously integrated into American logistics chains with priority American cargo access, were now free to restructure their operations around whichever trading partners offered the best terms. The framework had been America's lock on Canadian economic independence, and Trump had just picked the lock himself from the inside and handed Canada the key. Within 1 week, Canada signed provisional trade memoranda with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. The EU agreement alone, fast-tracked through emergency provisions that bypassed the usual multi-year negotiation timeline, opened European markets to Canadian energy exports at prices 22% above what American buyers had been paying under the framework. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry announced a $2.3 billion investment in Canadian rare earth processing facilities, the exact kind of investment that framework exclusivity provisions had previously blocked. India signed a critical minerals partnership that gave Indian manufacturers access to Canadian lithium and cobalt, commodities that American battery manufacturers had assumed were exclusively theirs. The cage had kept the bird inside, but the cage had also kept the bird available. Trump opened the cage, and the bird didn't sit on the perch waiting to be invited back. It flew to markets that valued it more. Warren Buffett's response cut through the political noise, the diplomatic statements, the market volatility, and the cascading analysis with the precision of someone who has spent 7 decades watching organizations make exactly this mistake, and who understood with a clarity that comes only from repetition why the outcome is always the same. He did not talk about politics. He did not talk about Trump or Carney or the specific provisions of the framework. He talked about a pattern he had watched destroy partnerships, companies, supply chains, and empires. And he explained why the pattern is inescapable once the first move is made. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have watched every kind of mistake a leader can make. Most mistakes are recoverable. Bad strategy can be corrected. Poor execution can be improved. Even terrible timing can be survived if the fundamentals are sound. But there is one mistake that is not recoverable, and it is the mistake of firing a partner who was doing more for you than you were doing for them. Because the moment that partner is free, two things happen simultaneously, and both of them are devastating. First, they discover what they're actually worth on the open market, and it is always more than what you are paying them. Second, you discover what they were actually providing, and it is always more than what you thought. He applied it with surgical precision. The framework was the most lopsided deal in modern economic history, lopsided in America's favor. Canada was providing energy below global market rates, minerals below global market rates, integrated manufacturing labor below what any alternative would cost. Port access, grid synchronization, intelligence sharing, Arctic logistics, all flowing south across that border at prices that reflected partnership, not market value. And the United States was receiving all of it while apparently believing it was doing Canada a favor. He let that land. That is the most dangerous delusion in business, believing you are the benefactor when you are in fact the beneficiary. Because the moment you act on that delusion, the moment you fire the partner or expel the ally or tear up the agreement, reality arrives and reality does not negotiate. Buffett went deeper into the mechanics. I've sat across the table from CEOs who fired their most important supplier because the supplier pushed back on terms. Every single one of them told me the same thing beforehand. They need us more than we need them. And every single one of them discovered the same thing afterward. They were wrong. The supplier found new clients within weeks. The CEO spent months
Trying to replace what they'd lost at higher cost, lower quality, and worse terms. And by the time they realized the magnitude of the error, the supplier had moved on permanently. That is what is happening right now between the United States and Canada.
Canada is signing deals with Europe and Asia at prices America never offered. America is scrambling to find alternative sources for things it assumed would flow freely forever. And every day that passes makes the realignment more permanent, because every new deal Canada signs is a deal that didn't exist before Trump created the opening. His closing was devastating in its simplicity. People ask me whether Canada will come back to the framework. The question isn't whether Canada will come back, the question is whether Canada will want to. Before the expulsion, Canada had one major trading partner and limited alternatives. After the expulsion, Canada has the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and a line of nations stretching around the world, all offering better terms than America ever did. Trump didn't kick Canada out of the framework, he kicked America out of the best deal it ever had. And the first rule of business is when you find yourself in the best deal you've ever had, you don't tear it up. You write a thank you note, and then the consequences arrived. Not in weeks, not in months, not with a gradual onset that gives policymakers time to adjust and spin and reframe. Within days, across every sector that had been quietly and visibly entirely dependent on the framework's infrastructure, and that turned out to be nearly every sector in the American economy, the energy disruption hit first and hardest. Grid operators across 14 border states reported immediate instability as synchronized load balancing with Canadian systems went offline. New England, which had relied on Quebec hydroelectric imports for peak demand management through every winter in the framework's history, faced the coldest November in a decade, with 11% less grid capacity than the previous year. Natural gas prices in the upper Midwest surged 43% within 10 days as pipeline flow agreements reverted from framework terms to spot market pricing. The governor of Michigan held a press conference in front of an auto plant that had reduced shifts due to energy cost spikes and said what half of Washington was thinking, but nobody in the White House wanted to hear. We are watching the president dismantle the economic foundation of this region in real time. The framework wasn't a Canadian benefit, it was an American lifeline, and we just cut it ourselves. The critical mineral disruption rippled through the defense and technology sectors with a speed that alarmed the Pentagon. A Department of Defense internal memo leaked within the first week warned that the termination of framework mineral supply provisions created an immediate vulnerability in 7 active weapons procurement programs and introduced unacceptable supply chain risk to multiple major defense platforms. The memo recommended immediate engagement with Canadian authorities to establish emergency mineral supply agreements outside the framework structure, a recommendation that amounted to asking Canada to voluntarily restore, at Canada's discretion and Canada's price, access that America had just unilaterally revoked. The irony was not lost on anyone in Ottawa. A senior Canadian trade official speaking anonymously said, "They kicked us out on Monday. They're asking us back on Friday, but the price has changed." The auto industry cascading failure was the consequence that hit closest to home for the largest number of Americans. Within 2 weeks, 3 major assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio announced temporary shutdowns. Not because of demand issues, not because of labor disputes, but because parts that had crossed the border seamlessly under framework harmonization were now stuck in customs processing that added days to delivery times and thousands of dollars to per-vehicle costs. Ford issued a statement calling the framework termination the most significant disruption to North American automotive manufacturing since the pandemic. General Motors estimated a per-vehicle cost increase of $12,000 if the framework was not restored within 90 days. The United Auto Workers issued a statement that cut through the corporate language. Our members are being sent home because the president decided to blow up the system that kept their plants running. These aren't layoffs. These are casualties of a policy that nobody in this industry asked for, nobody in this industry wanted, and nobody in this industry can survive. The international realignment accelerated at a pace that stunned American diplomatic observers. Canada's provisional agreements with the EU, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia were followed within 3 weeks by framework-level discussions with ASEAN, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the African Union. Discussions that would have been unthinkable under the framework's exclusivity provisions, but that were now not only possible, but actively sought by nations eager to lock in access to Canadian resources before the market repriced permanently. The EU's trade commissioner said publicly that Canada was an energy superpower, a mineral superpower, and a geographic superpower, and that the only reason European markets hadn't had full access was the framework's exclusivity provisions, and that those provisions were now gone. Japan's prime minister was more direct. Canada is open. We will not hesitate. In the space of 3 weeks, Canada went from a nation locked into a single dominant trade relationship to the most courted resource partner on Earth.